So I'm going to start with this. One of the things we're going to talk about is church growth. But in my experience, and also this is not original with me, but when a church reaches about 300, there is a transition that takes place and needs to take place. So I want to talk a little bit about that because the leaders become more important than ever before. And by the way, just by way of recapping, so you'll know, most of you know, but I'll just share. My wife and I started a church in Austin, Texas 20 years ago. And then we served there for 18 years until I was elected general superintendent. So we started in our living room, and then we moved to a building that we shared with another church. We rented a Sunday and had a Sunday afternoon service, and then we were there for 4 years in that rented facility, setting up our keyboard and PA system every Sunday. And then after 4 years, we built our first building that would seat about 300, and then another 4 years, we built our second building that would seat about 650. And now the church is finishing up their new building on the freeway, and the initial phase will seat 1,000, but they have room for 2,000. Just a matter of knocking out the wall, putting in the risers. And then they have expansion plans after that. And we grew to, I would say, well, on our attendance roll, our Sunday school roll, about 950. Those are the people who are supposed to show up any given Sunday. Now, that does not mean they were there. As far as an actual attendance, we probably had an average of 700. A good Sunday, we'd have 750. Easter Sunday, we would have 950. So that kind of gives you an idea if you want to know that. Of course, when I go to the bank to get a loan, we say, look, compared to the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Catholics, everybody that claims this is their church, that if they're in trouble, they call me. If they need in the hospital, they need to get married, and they want to use the church, or they're having a funeral, well, we probably have 1,500 constituents, extended family and friends that when they come, that would be their church. So that gives you several different measures. And the reason why I say that is because we went through the various stages, and I'm going to briefly retrace some stages. When a church is about 0 to 50, we can call it a cell congregation. And what we mean by that is everybody is connected to everybody else. The reason why they love their church is not because it has all the great programs, because it can't. But it's because everybody knows everybody, they feel part of the family. Now, when you get beyond about 50, you start losing that. And, of course, you have to compensate in other ways if you really want to be good at it. And cell ministry is one of the ways that you do that. But when you go from about 50 to 150, it's a pastor-centered congregation. In other words, everybody knows the pastor personally. The pastor is likely the one who invited them, or else counseled them, or else prayed for them when they received the Holy Ghost, or else discipled them. He was the one that consolidated them being in the church because he visited them in the hospital, he spent time with them. And it's amazing, I would find even a church as small as 75 people, we would say something like, well, Sister so-and-so is sick, pray for her. And I would talk to someone, well, who's Sister so-and-so? What do you mean? I know everybody in this church. How come you can't know Sister so-and-so? She's 65 years old, sits in the corner, she has white hair. Oh, yeah, I know she is. But they don't have a personal relationship. But they have a personal relationship with the pastor. And so everybody's connected, kind of like a family, because they're connected to the pastor. But once you get to 100 or certainly 150, a pastor and his wife working full-time, that's about the maximum they can personally stay in touch with on a close basis. Counsel them, visit them in the hospital every day they're there, drink coffee with them, visit their home, take their phone calls. One pastor who's engaged, that answers all his calls or returns all of his calls. When you get about 100 to 150 in attendance, that's about all we can handle. So if you're going to go over 150 to about 300, the resource that I was reading, they called it a program-centered congregation. And I don't know if I exactly like that, but it does make sense. And that is, when you get to the level of 150 to 300, what keeps people coming, they may not even have a close relationship with the pastor. It may be a month or two. The pastor may know who they are, may have shaken their hand, may have baptized them, but may not have had an extended conversation, much less gone out to dinner or visited their home for months or years. But the reason why they come is they get connected, maybe through the youth ministry, or maybe through the children's ministry. Maybe they start coming because their kids need Sunday school, and their kids love Sunday school, so they say, well, we're just going to keep coming here. So they didn't come because they know the pastor, or because they sat and heard him preach, and they said, I've got to go where he's preaching, but because our kids love Sunday school. Our family is friends with this other family. And so they're in the church because of the various programs and ministries of the church, which means it has to become more of a team leadership. And that's why most churches in the USA of all denominations, including UPC, the average size is about 75. Because once you start getting to 100, or as I said, 150, you cannot grow with the pastor being the sole engine of growth. A team has to take responsibility. Now, you must have been operating this way for years, because you've been a solid, strong church for years. And while the pastor is certainly the leader of the team and the key person in many ways to set the tone and cast the vision, he can't build or grow or maintain a church of this size by personal effort alone. It's got to be a team. Oh, and team dynamics become very important. Now, when you get to 300 and above, the source I use, which again, I'm not sure I like the title, but I can't think of a better one. They call it corporate style leadership. And what they mean by that is you have leaders within the congregation who in essence have their own constituency, like a church within a church. And we certainly don't mean this in the sense of separation. We don't mean that in the sense of taking the place of the pastor. But what we mean, the leaders have to take responsibility for growth in their own area. The pastor casts the vision for the church, but he cannot cast the vision for every department from scratch. At least my experience. You know, at a certain point, I didn't want to have to meet every week with the youth pastor to give him a list of 10 things to do. And here's how to do it. And I wanted him to come to me with 10 things he wanted to do. I wanted to be excited, passionate. He said, you know, I've prayed, I've studied, I've done the research, I've talked to what other youth groups are doing, I've gone to community, I've learned what the youth team wants us to do, and here's what I'm passionate about. And then I could say, well, I don't want to do this one, but I want to do this one. Or have you thought about this? Or I think in implementing this in our church, you might consider this way. You know, so I could guide or tweak. But I wanted him to have the vision. I wanted him to carry the burden. I wanted him to give his, so to speak, expert advice on what he felt the youth group needed. Now that, I believe, is where your church is and needs to be, where each leader needs to take responsibility for your area and for growth in your area. How does my ministry help grow the church? And you can't say, well, growth is not my responsibility, that's the pastor's responsibility. You know, I'm just doing this. I'm just responsible for maintaining. No, you're not. If you are the leader, you have to think and understand. I'm not talking about in a separatist sense, a different vision. You have to follow the pastor's vision very closely, but you have to sense as if it were that area, as if you were the pastor of that church. You have to feel that sense of responsibility for your area. Because face it, you may have as many people that are working with you that you're trying to motivate as a typical pastor of a church of 50 people or 25 people. I mean, your group of workers or your group of people that you're trying to lead may be bigger than a church across town. You see? So you have to feel the same sense of responsibility. I'm responsible for growth. So the youth leader needs to think, how can we reach young people that nobody else in the church is going to reach? And if we reach them, that can in turn help us reach families, and so we will help grow the church. The music leader, okay, much of their work may be, yes, keeping the services the way they need to be and doing what the pastor says, but at least some component should be, as they brainstorm with their team, what can we do musically that helps bring people in the church that otherwise may not come? What can we do to involve new people or involve converts that otherwise are not getting involved. In other words, how can we grow the church? Don't depend on the church to grow your ministry. Your ministry has to grow the church. You see, it's a change, a paradigm shift. So that's probably where you are as a church. You have to work as a team, and you have to take responsibility for your area. Now, when I say work as a team, I found this to be interesting as a pastor. I try to be a good leader, and we'll talk a little bit about that, for my leadership team. Communicate with them, cast vision, mentor them, train them, give them input, give them real, delegate, give them real authority, real responsibility, listen to their ideas, as I explained before, not just having lists of telling them what to do, but asking them to be creative and come up with a plan and come to me. Okay, and leaders usually love that. When it really works, when you really work as a team, you appreciate that. And you have a hard time working where somebody's just authoritarian, even if they got great ideas. It's hard just to sit there and you do this, you do that, you do that. We need your expertise, but here's how you're going to use it. But here's the problem. Leaders are all excited, fired up. They appreciate the pastor's vision, the way he works. And so they go to their little team and they give orders like a little dictator. And you're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and you're going to do that because I've got the vision for my ministry, my group. But here's the thing. The same way you want your leader to involve you, you have to involve your team. Now you're responsible for a team. And if your church is like ours was at this level, oftentimes, when the church was small, everybody comes to the pastor for advice. Everybody comes to the pastor when there's a problem. Church gets bigger, very often the pastor is not the first line of response. Someone else is the first one to hear a need or a problem. And for the church to be successful, a lot of leaders have to be able to handle those first line responses without necessarily involving the pastor. So you now have to develop the characteristics that your pastor has. And again, I don't mean replacing him. I don't mean duplicating him. I don't mean that you can be what he is. But I mean, you have to have the same type of burden and love and involvement with people at your level as in the past your pastor has had for you. Otherwise, the church cannot grow past the limitations of the people. So we all have to grow in our roles. So I'm just kind of giving you an overview before we get into a little bit more specific thing, that a church of this size has got to focus on team leadership. That team leadership has to be duplicated at every level of the structure. And each leader has to take responsibility for revival and growth in his or her area. Now, if you get out of your depth, that's where you can say, well, I'm not the pastor, go talk to the pastor. I mean, that's where you can say, you know what, pastor, I think you need to help us here. So you've got an out, In some ways, it's the perfect place to be. Because you've got lots of authority and lots of responsibility until you don't want it. And then you can say, well, after all, I'm not the pastor. I can't decide anything. But in the real world, many things will never get to the pastor unless they come through you. So your role is very critical and very important.